breaking down the walls in order to stop the violence, prison abolition through the lens of trauma healing.
When viewed through the lens of trauma healing, prisons must be abolished in order to stop the cycles of abuse and violence that they perpetuate. People experience emotional, physical, and sexual trauma while in prison. Further, most prisoners have experienced high levels of trauma and violence prior to their incarceration. When trauma is not treated or healed, it can result in both the internalization and the externalization of pain. Victims can turn into victimizers when their bodies house unhealed trauma. Therefore, trauma healing is an integral part of stopping cycles of violence and of decreasing future violent or criminal behavior. While necessary, such healing cannot possibly occur in the context of prisons.
We take a unique approach to the analysis of trauma in prisons by incorporating narrative examples from my experience as a former inmate. I served 12 years in prison in the United States. These narrative accounts focus on traumatic incidents that I experienced or observed while in prison. We then explore broader themes relating to trauma healing in order to highlight the impossibility of healing trauma inside prisons.
Part 1. Trauma in the context of prisons. Trauma occurs when people experience an event that threatens their sense of safety, producing terror or feelings of helplessness and overwhelming one's ability to cope with the threat. Although traumatic events affect everyone differently, an experience can generally be defined as traumatic if it overwhelms our usual ability to cope with and respond to threat. In many ways, prisons are structured so as to create conditions that breed trauma. Many people housed in overcrowded, small spaces, subjected to rituals of degradation, resort to violence as a means of self-preservation in order to protect themselves physically or to preserve their identities by demanding respect. In this part, we explore a variety of ways in which trauma characterizes the experience of being incarcerated. The pervasive nature of traumatic experiences in the lives of people in prison highlights the inherent connection between trauma and prisons. It is virtually impossible to conceptualize a prison that does not create conditions that lead to trauma. Trauma is thus an inevitable component of a system of incarceration. Therefore, prison abolition is the only viable alternative to stop this state-sponsored infliction of violence, abuse, and degradation.
Violence between inmates. Those of us who have been incarcerated know that violence in prisons are inseparable. I was locked up from the age of 16 until the age of 28. Over the years, violence and the ever-present threat of violence became the most consistent aspect of my living conditions. Violence was so pervasive in the prisons where I was housed that it was virtually impossible for me to trust anyone, including my own friends. Violent attacks occurred regularly between different prison gangs, generally divided along racial lines in California prisons. These incidents usually sparked riots. Even within racial groups or prison gangs, people frequently assault one another. In a prison riot, it is a profoundly traumatic experience in that it exposes people to the graphic violence of hand-to-hand combat that one would generally only expect in a war. The trauma of the experience is exacerbated because there is no option to flee, given that people are literally locked into an enclosed space. Furthermore, given the dynamics between inmates in prison, people are forced to participate in the violence even when they do not want to. Thus, people also experience the trauma of participating in inflicting violence. Being in the midst of a riot is chaotic. People attack each other from all sides, and a combination of fear and survival instinct seems to propel people to be more violent. As an inmate in the midst of a riot, one must decide whether to comply with institutional policies by lying down on the ground in order to avoid being shot by the guards. This is not really an option because there is a high probability of being attacked by other inmates while lying on the ground. I was exposed to hundreds of violent incidents while I was in prison. I was unfortunate enough to see someone walk up to a man with whom I was talking and slice his throat with a razor blade. Blood splurted everywhere, covering his white t-shirt and splattering onto my arms as I jumped back in shock. I witnessed other people get stabbed on various occasions. Often people were stabbed up to 20 times in a row, leading to bloody scenes and serious injuries. I recall hearing someone scream repeatedly from within the confines of his locked cell, pleading for his life as his cellmate stabbed him to death. I felt helpless hearing his plea, as I was trapped within my cell as well. Most prison assaults are meticulously planned and happen when one least expects it, which is why in prison people learn to expect the worst. This contributes to people living in a chronic state of hypervigilance, which is difficult to move past even after one's time in prison is over. I remember a stabbing that occurred in the midst of a basketball game when two members of one team attacked a player from the other team. I witnessed a man lying on the floor unconscious with his head cracked open, while other men continued to stomp and kick him as his limp body moved around like a rag doll. And my memories feel endless. There was a guy who commented on the picture of his friend's girlfriend, who found himself getting his neck and face sliced an hour later because of his friend's psychotic jealousy. I remember another man who had an overdue drug debt of $50. He died due to a fatal shank to his heart because of this debt. Exposure to such high levels of violence has a profound impact on people that often continues long after one is released.
Correctional officers. The violence within a prison is so pervasive that it encompasses everyone within its limited boundaries, including those who work on the inside. Prison guards, referred to as correctional officers or COs in California prisons in the United States, are often on both the giving and receiving ends of violence.
I had numerous abusive experiences at the hands of COs. On one occasion, I was taken into a room for getting into a disagreement with a CO. I was verbally taunted and beaten while I was shackled. My body ached so much that I was not able to eat without excruciating pain for weeks after the beating. Trauma is also inflicted in more passive ways. I saw an elderly man having a heart attack while a group of COs slowly sauntered towards him. He died because he did not receive timely medical attention. I witnessed a group of 6 COs beat and pepper spray a Samoan guy for 15 minutes without mercy, simply because he had refused to walk in a straight line. There were also COs who would purposely unlock people's cell doors in order to allow their enemies to enter their cells. My good friend had an argument with a CO one day. Later on that night, they came and picked him up from the dorm. I didn't see him for 2 months. When he returned from the hole, he told me they had took him to a room and stripped him of all his clothing. They slapped him, pepper sprayed him, and beat him with their batons. There was a highly publicized group of COs in California's Corcoran State Prison who would stage gladiator-style fights between inmates, betting on which one would win. There were numerous allegations of COs shooting inmates during these fights. COs also find themselves as victims. They are constant targets within prison walls. Inmates throw bodily fluids such as semen, feces, and urine at them, for example. I recall a CO who came to help my neighbor move to another cell block. I watched through the window of my cell as the CO held my neighbor's TV in order to assist him. In response, my neighbor started slicing this man's face with a razor blade. Another time, I saw a nurse come to a cell to deliver medication, only to be punched in the face by the man she was trying to help. Sexual assault. The prevalence of sexual assault within prisons is well documented. My exposure to this problem was limited due to strict rules among Hispanic inmates within California prisons. Any kind of homosexual activities were strictly forbidden according to the inmate code, and violations of this rule resulted in stabbings. I do recall one night, about an hour after the lights were turned off, loud screams echoed throughout the unit. A grown man was screaming, pleading, "Please stop," as he was beaten and raped repeatedly by his cellmate. I also remember hearing about a guy in the unit